Hello F1 fans, welcome back to the F1 Masters podcast brought to you by AUBG Daily. As usual, you're joined by myself, David, and Harry. Unfortunately, Vasco isn't here with us today. He decided he was too big for this podcast and went on to do bigger things in life. I'm just joking, he just couldn't be here. Today we'll be discussing what happened during the Australian Grand Prix weekend, and we will start with the practice sessions.
So practice was quite eventful. For example, in FP1 there were quite a lot of driver mistakes, quite a lot of off-track excursions, and I think it was because of the mixed weather, mainly because drivers had to adapt to the rain which came in the end of the practice session, for example in FP1. And another talking point was Sergio Perez's problems in FP3 because he had 4 off-track incidents.
Speaking of Perez and his issues, we move on to qualifying, and he had once again more problems. He went off track on his first lap in qualifying and ended up last for the race. In other news, Mercedes were very impressive, second and third on the grid for Hamilton and Russell. Russell second, Hamilton third. The Ferraris, once again, quite disappointing from their side. P5 and P7 for Sainz and Leclerc. And also to mention, Albon's impressive P8 in the Williams. Of course, last in the standings last year, and to have that car in Q3 is very impressive from the Thailand driver. So now we'll move on to the race, and we'll start off with our race rundown. The podium finishers were in first place, Max Verstappen, second place, Lewis Hamilton, and third place, Fernando Alonso. And we had a total of 8 DNFs in the race, and those were Gasly, Ocon, De Vries, Sargent, Magnussen, Russell, Albon, and Leclerc, which was quite chaotic to say the least.
And moving on to the highlights of the race, lap 1 was quite interesting, to be honest. I was quite impressed by Mercedes' start because both Mercedes managed to overtake Max Verstappen by the end of the first lap. George Russell did it at the first corner, Lewis Hamilton a bit later. And another one important to mention is Charles Leclerc's DNF because of the incident he had with Lance Stroll. To be honest, it was a racing incident for me because they didn't leave each other too much space and none was to be at fault, in my opinion. It was quite unfortunate for Charles. I think he could have managed to get a decent result in this race.
Yeah, about the start, Mercedes, we saw George Russell get off the line better than Verstappen, and Verstappen uncharacteristically was quite conservative on the first lap. It felt kind of easy the way the Mercedes got past him. I feel like he knows how good his car is, so he doesn't need to take the risks on lap 1 in order to potentially end his race. As we saw later on, he eventually got past the Mercedes. I was very impressed with the start. As for Leclerc, a racing incident, I feel like it was quite unfortunate the way things happened, and Leclerc has second DNF in 3 races. It's getting even worse as the season's progressing. I don't know how Charles feeling with that Ferrari and how the results are going, but he definitely needs a good result in the next few races.
For example, even Lando Norris is ahead of him in the Drivers' Championship at the moment, which is quite concerning, I think, for Charles.
Moving on, we had an incident quite early on in the race. Alex Albon, who was running in a fantastic P6 in the Williams, he had a great start as well. He spun and hit the wall quite hard, and there was initially a safety car, but then the red flag came out. What were your thoughts about the decision process from the FIA? Do you think it should have been a red flag, or was a safety car enough?
I think personally that the safety car would have been enough because they would need 2 laps to get the car out of the racing line or like the track. And I think that this was an unnecessary red flag. Talking of the red flag, it screwed a lot of people over. For example, George Russell, he pitted right before the red flag, as well as Carlos Sainz. Both of them dropped down the order, and this hurt their chances of a better result later in the race.
George Russell, he pit under the safety car. Same for Carlos Sainz, with the goal to, of course, gain an advantage on their opponents. Russell, after the race, said that he was quite surprised that Hamilton and Verstappen didn't pit, and he felt that his strategy was the best. But unfortunately, the red flag meant that he lost track position and everyone could change their tires, which begs the question, should drivers be allowed to change their tires under red flags? What do you think, Harry?
They shouldn't, because this impacts the race quite a lot. When you get out on track on new tires after the red flag period, and others have, as we said, have pitted before, right before the red flag, it's just not fair, I think. This should be changed in the rules. FIA decision making.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And speaking of Russell, who had a fantastic race, I have to say, it was really unfortunate the way the red flag screwed him over. But even more calamity for him as his engine blew up and there was quite a lot of flames coming out of the back of the Mercedes, which is not something we're used to seeing. As we remember last year, the Mercedes was arguably the most reliable car on the grid. So it was a very disappointing end to George Russell's race, who I feel deserved at least a podium from that race.
Yeah, I think he would have gotten the podium at least, probably. He would be somewhere around Lewis Hamilton's pace, I think, even though the red flag screwed him over. And I was quite surprised with the engine blow-up because I think Mercedes has decent reliability currently.
Do you think Russell could have potentially even beaten Lewis? Because his pace, he had a faster lap in qualifying, he took the lead of the race. Yes, he was under pressure at the start of the race, but I think the strategy could have really benefited him. And also, maybe we should start having the conversation, as Russell potentially even better than Hamilton? Because even though Lewis has more points to start the season, I feel like Russell has been performing slightly better.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. For example, in qualifying, he outperformed Lewis, and in the race, he was leading right before the safety car. And I think that George really would have even probably overtaken Lewis by the end of the race if his engine had not blew up. And I think that, yeah, his prospects for this year's intra-team battle are quite good. I think that George is gonna finish again ahead of Lewis in the Drivers' Championship, except if his car isn't reliable, as we saw in this race.
After the engine blow up, I guess nothing really happened, it felt like. I mean, Verstappen overtook Hamilton for the lead fairly easily, but that wasn't really surprising. And then there was kind of a stalemate between the drivers from second to sixth. They were all in a train and couldn't pass each other. But then we had, of course, the Kevin Magnussen crash with 2 laps to go, pretty much out of nowhere, and it resulted in a second red flag, which changed the race completely, we have to say. What were your thoughts about the Magnussen crash?
I mean, it was quite strange. To be honest, when I was watching the replays, it was not a big hit in the wall, but still the tire just managed to get out of the wheel. It was strange.
Yeah, it actually even hit the spectator, which was quite surprising in a way. The organizers said it was like an anomaly incident, so it shouldn't happen again. But yeah, another red flag was brought out. The FIA, in my opinion, felt like the race shouldn't end under a safety car, even though they've done this countless times, and the race probably should have ended under a safety car. But they decided to create a red flag and another standing start. That standing start, let's talk about it. One of the craziest restarts we've seen in recent history. We had Alonso getting spun by Sainz, the Alpines crashing together in the wall, Logan Sargent taking out Nick De Vries, Lance Stroll locking up and going off the track. I mean, it was just total chaos.
The replays were constantly going on during the red flag, which resulted from this chaos. Third red flag in the race. First race ever with 3 red flags. That's what I read. So many things happened. For example, the Alpine crash, they're the 4th team that have a crash between their drivers during the turbo hybrid era, after Mercedes 2016 Spain, Red Bull Baku 2018, and Ferrari Brazil 2019. The crash was quite unfortunate, I think. No one was to blame because it was just a racing incident. What do you think?
Pierre, he obviously went deep into turn 1 and had to avoid the Alonso Sainz incident. He went off track, his tires were dirty, a couple drivers overtook him. And I think he just didn't see Ocon next to him. And it was just an unlucky incident. And such a shame for Pierre, who had an incredible race. I mean, he was running in P5 for most of it. And he was right on the back of Sainz, Alonso, and Hamilton. They were all running like within 4 seconds of each other, which was very promising pace from Alpine and from Gasly in particular. Speaking of the restart chaos, we have to mention the Sainz-Alonso incident. Of course, there's no denying that Sainz was at fault there. I think it's clear to see that it was his fault. But the FIA, after the red flag, they decided to reinstate the positions, which basically meant that Alonso didn't lose all his places, and they put him back up into 3rd. But Sainz still got a penalty, which doesn't make any sense because the lap didn't exist technically. And why should Sainz get penalized when Alonso got reinstated his place? I don't understand it. And he dropped from 4th to last as a result, which is absurd. in my opinion. What do you think, Harry?
I was so surprised to see that FIA took the decision because it would have been logical only if the results from the lap after the restart were kept. And in this case, when the lap was just non-existent, and then the penalty doesn't even make any sense.
They reinstate the positions, but for example, the Alpines can't finish the race because they were both out. So I don't understand why. I mean, if you've decided to make the red flag, you should at least stick to the fact that you made a red flag, because the fact that they undid the positions, it basically meant that the red flag should have never happened in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, for the second race in a row, FIA are making questionable decisions, which just the fans are quite concerned with that, to be honest. Everyone is talking about FIAs.
Yeah. I mean, Michael Massey was at the track this weekend, so maybe that had a role to play with it. I don't know. But yeah, it was a real shame for Sainz because he had a great race, in my opinion. He was making some great overtakes and showed some good pace. And with that crazy restart, it allowed for a lot of midfield drivers to get some great results. We saw the McLarens, both Norris and Piastri, score their first points of the season. Nico Hülkenberg, P7. Zhou Guanyu, P9, and Yuki Tsunoda, P10. All of these drivers got their first points of the season. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the chaos quite helped these midfield teams quite a lot. But still, I think that some of these drivers would have gotten points even without the chaos. For example, Lando Norris was running quite comfortably in P8, 9 before the incident, before the red flag. And I mean that McLaren seemed to have improved in this race. They did not have the bad pace they had during the first two races, which is quite promising for the team, to be honest.
Speaking of McLaren, they're now fifth in the constructors' standings, which is, I mean, I don't think anyone thought that would happen going into this race weekend. But yeah, they were lucky to avoid any incidents, but also Norris, I was very impressed with his pace and, of course, scoring his first points in F1, which I think he'll be very proud of. Nico Hülkenberg as well has to be said in the Haas, drove a great race, and actually, if they did not reinstate the positions after the red flag, he would have been fourth, and with Sainz's penalty, he would have gotten on the podium, which would have been a dream to see, but sadly that didn't happen. But it goes to show how great of a race he had.
Yeah, so close yet so far. It's the same old story for Nico, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, OF1 fans want to see him on the podium. Hopefully it happens this season in another chaotic race similar to this one, hopefully.
Yeah.
We all want to see it, I think.
Absolutely. And now we'll move on to the championship update. Max Verstappen, of course, leads the championship, and with Sergio Perez finishing down in fifth place, it means that he's opened up a gap of 15 points over the Mexican. And following that, we have Alonso, Hamilton, Sainz, Stroll, Russell, Norris in 8th, Hülkenberg and Charles Leclerc down in 10th. And as for the constructors, Red Bull continue to dominate. Aston Martin are second ahead of Mercedes in a quite tight gap, and then we got a pretty big gap to Ferrari in fourth because they scored no points in Australia, and McLaren moving up to fifth thanks to their incredible double points finish.
Moving on to our fun rubrics, we have to begin with the highlight of the weekend.
The highlight of the weekend for me is Mercedes. I have to give it to that team for getting a 2-3 in qualifying. They were 1-2 in the race at one point. Both drivers led the Grand Prix. It was a shame, of course, for George Russell's retirement because this was a real opportunity for them to score some big points. But Hamilton was very impressive. Alonso couldn't get within the RS range of him throughout the entire race. So Lewis really proved just how good of a driver he is, and also that car really is not as bad as they say it is. I expect the development to go really well at Mercedes. If they're scoring podiums in the third race of the season, I think that they'll be challenging for race wins halfway through the season.
I absolutely agree about Mercedes, but for me personally it was McLaren because their pace seemed to be quite a lot better. I was quite pleased to see them go back up the order. The surprise of the weekend, what would you say?
I would have to say Pierre Gasly because he drove a fantastic race. He was running top 5 the whole race, and it was such a shame the way his race ended. But I think this is the Pierre Gasly that we knew from 2020, who was the boss of the midfield and could really drag the maximum out of the car.
I'll have to say Lando Norris because of his impressive pace.
Moving on to the disappointment of the weekend, what would you say?
I would say Alex Albon because he was running comfortably in P6 and that crash just impacted him and the team so badly. What do you think?
I say that's pretty disappointing. For me, it has to be Charles Leclerc. Another DNF, lap 1 crash that maybe if he took it more conservatively, he could have avoided the incident. It's a shame really for Charles, but he'll have to learn from this race.
Moving on to the predictions from our previous episode. So you said that Oscar Piastri would get points, correct? And that the race would not be a Red Bull 1-2, also correct. So you have 2 points in the overall leaderboard.
Yeah, I was quite pleased with myself when I saw that Piastri somehow got in the points. And yeah, the Red Bull 1-2, I felt it was quite bold at the time, but I guess I was lucky that Perez had such a bad weekend. What about your predictions? You had Bottas in the points so close, he finished P11.
Yeah, it was a close one indeed. And Vasco's prediction was that George Russell would get a podium. This one did not happen. And Stroll would be top 5, which was true. Yeah. And he also has 2 points in the leaderboard, while I have only 0.5 points because of my prediction that Alonso would be close to the Red Bulls in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, Vasco also I'd like to mention, he tried to argue that he said a Mercedes podium and not a Russell podium, but he did specify Russell, and also he is not here to argue for himself, so he's going to have to take the L on that one. What about predictions for the next race in Azerbaijan? I have picked a Ferrari podium and Gasly to finish best of the rest, which basically means not including the Red Bulls, Mercedes, Astons, or Ferraris. What about you?
Yeah, I would say that's a bold one. Mercedes get the win in Azerbaijan. It does not sound realistic, but still, I would like this one to stay. And also, Logan Sargent is going to get points.
Okay, and Vasco's predictions, he says that the Red Bulls will crash, similar to Azerbaijan 2018, and also he predicts an Aston Martin win.
So guys, this is all for today from us. We're looking forward to the next race week in Azerbaijan. Till then, like, subscribe and follow us on AUBG Daily on Instagram and Facebook, and stay tuned for more of our content. Thank you, and remember, if you no longer go for a gap that exists,
you're no longer a racing driver.